Any further ado, we can go ahead and get started. My name is Yasamin Rasulzadeh, and I'll be opening up our workshop today, and then we will be handing off to the project team to carry you all through a productive discussion. So thank you for joining us in the second round of the transportation workshop. Let's go ahead and get started. I do want to note that we are recording this meeting, which will be posted to our engagement site and may be used for public viewing later. So we will be using a variety of methods to hear from you today. You will have the same features whether you are joining from your computer or your cell phone. And you can type in your thoughts using the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you are joining by cell, you can select the three dots at the lower right of your screen and open up the chat. If you would like to speak over the audio, please use the raise your hand option, also located at the bottom of your screen. And if you're calling in, please enter *9. Additionally, we will pause in between our speakers to ask questions and hear your thoughts, and the majority of our time will be focused on hearing your comments and answering your questions as best we can. So here are those same features, Zoom features, but from a mobile view for anyone who may be joining from their mobile device through the Zoom app. And if you select more at the bottom of the taskbar in Zoom, you will see the options to chat. You can select the language of choice, raise your hand, and indicate how you would like to speak as well. All right, so there you go. Thank you for taking the time to listen to these features. Again, my name is Yasamin. I'm part of the project team that the County of San Diego Land Use and Environment Group has formed to help move forward in developing the regional decarbonization framework. Today, you will also hear from Mortaza Baksamusa, the Program Manager for Regional Sustainability in the Land Use Environment Group Executive Office, as well as Scott Anders, the Director of Energy Policy Initiative Center at the University of San Diego. We also have a few short presentations prepared for you today by the Energy Policy Initiative Center, Qualcomm Technologies, and the Environmental Health Coalition. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to just set the stage for how these working groups are structured and our agenda for the day, and also remind you that we are continuing to use the Engage platform to post our working group documents, recordings, as well as materials to review. So if you have any questions on registering to the site and accessing your working group documents, please send us an email and we will help you through that. As some of you may know, and for those who are joining for the first time, we have set up 5 special topic working groups to focus on key emitting sectors and solutions for addressing our changing climate. These will categorize and guide the development of the implementation playbook with a draft ready by the end of the year. For today's agenda, we will begin with 3 invited guests, Dr. Nilmani Silva Sen from Energy Policy Initiative Center at University of San Diego School of Law, Jim Meisner from Qualcomm, and Kyle Heiskala from the Environmental Health Coalition. After their presentations, our consultants, Scott Anders from the Energy Policy Initiative Innovation Center at USD, will discuss their approach to the implementation playbook and the draft matrix of decarbonization actions for the transportation sector. Mortaza will then facilitate an open discussion where we would like to hear from all of you. And with that, I will hand it over to Mortaza to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Yasamin. So we have a new and exciting approach to getting input into the development of our implementation strategy. We have heard that there are many stakeholders and experts that have given thought to the plans, programs, and pilots to begin implementing decarbonization in our region. So we want to gather these ideas, learn from the knowledge out there in the community and in other parts of the country and around the world, so that we can focus on action. The format of this workshop, where we have flipped the roles such that the stakeholders present and the government listens, is a pilot of our own. So I hope that you will come along with us in this journey to explore new ways of public outreach. If this is successful, we will be building an online repository of ideas or an ideas bank with 5 to 7 minute presentations, followed by questions from the moderator. That will be me today. So first up, we have a presentation from Dr. Nilmani Silva Sen. Dr. Silva Sen is an Associate Director and C. Hugh Friedman Fellow in Energy Law and Policy at the Energy Policy Initiative Center at the USD School of Law. She has over 20 years of professional experience and leads climate action planning work at the School of Law and particularly focuses on transportation and energy requirements and greenhouse gas implications of water use in our region. Dr. Salma Send, go ahead.
Thank you, Murtaza. We can go right to the next slide. Okay, so really what I'm going to talk about is sort of the academic approaches to transportation decarbonization, what we're seeing in the literature. Even though EPIC, we do not do original R&D, we do track what's going on in the literature. And to start with, I want to put the RDF chapters into context. We have 2 chapters in that relating to it, and that's chapter 3, which brings out the modeling approaches used, the differing modeling approaches used. One is the energy pathways modeling of primary energy supply and demand. And what it does is it provides the type of fuel shifts that are needed to meet the targets. And these are really used at the UN, at the US, state and regional levels. But it does not account for some sort of behaviors like speed or the impacts of gasoline prices or other modes of travel. And then there is the activity-based model, which is the ABM2 Plus that SANDAG uses. You probably have heard of it. It is a demand model, and it really is based on people's daily activities, when they occur, for how long, with whom, and the choices they can make and they would like to make at a very high level of spatial resolution. They also use empirical data through surveys or GPS data or cellular data, real-time data from the highway systems, data monitoring systems like PEMS or HPMS. And they base it on a transportation and land use network that really is based on what the cities have provided to the agency. And they do this for a chosen baseline year, and then they make projections for population and for jobs, housing, and VMT. And so it is from this model that the VMT for the climate action plans are obtained. So chapter 8 in the RDF deals with local policy opportunities. And really, we have to remember that CAPs kind of represent a snapshot in time of hopefully somewhat of the stakeholder perspectives or what they believe what local governments can do to regulate, incentivize, and educate the community on how to get GHG reduction, especially in transportation. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to slip into the discussions that are going on in the academic literature. The first one I want to just focus on in this one, it's talking about the supply and demand approaches to transportation decarbonization, and that basically, when we look at this, we're looking for both any type of transportation, really, supply side technological solutions like EVs or shared autonomous vehicles or alternative engines and fuels, but also we're looking at the demand side. So mobility, demand for access, and then mode shift. And this particular representative paper that we sort of looked at talks about the methodological challenges. They call it a methodological challenge of how to reconcile these 2 approaches. And basically they say, how are we going to derive the full quantified pathways? Because these models are huge and they lack kind of flexibility to consider the full set of decarbonization drivers. And especially important for policymaking is that this type of modeling doesn't really allow for much stakeholder participation. So there's a lack of that. So what the study does in this particular paper is that they develop what's called a quantitative, qualitative, iterative, participatory process framework to construct decarb pathways and scenarios. And they actually test it at the country level. So they test it with Japan, with the UK, with France, and in Mexico. And to give you an example, the paper discusses how mode shift, for example, is a consequence of infrastructure, land use, speed, safety, so that qualitatively you need to go out and ask these countries or these communities, which geography, urban, suburban, rural, what speed would you make a shift in mode? And qualitatively, we need to sort of combine the belief of people on quality of life and look at the households in particular geographical areas and which areas can consider reducing VMT, for example. So in their study, which they applied to those 4 countries I mentioned, Japan, for example, thought that it would be able to reduce VMT by 40% between 2010 and 2050. And that's something I think we have a very hard time achieving. But Mexico thought that they could only support like a 6% reduction in VMT. France, on the other hand, thought that they can make their urban and their suburban areas more compact and therefore be able to shift modes significantly. And also, they thought they would be able to shift mode from air travel for long distance leisure travel to rail and bus. So this means generally that this model showed that there are these variabilities depending on what people think they can do and so on, and that there needs to be like a greater understanding of social dynamics that underlie this mobility of passengers. And you need to complement those things to a technology-based approach. And different communities of stakeholders have quite different ideas about what our low carbon future should look like. So their conclusion is that we need a framework that can do this sort of qualitative or semi-quantitative framework that's understandable by all stakeholders, and that we should have comparable quantitative scenarios and ask public questions in the context of deep decarbonization. And there is no approach to do this in a transparent kind of way. It's still to be improved or to be done. Next slide, please. So the next discussion going on in the literature is a discussion on autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles move people or cargo without human intervention. And although it's still in our infancy, we do have some experience with on-demand services right now. And some sources, for example, Navigant Consulting says that 75% of the new passenger vehicles will be automated by 2035 in the US. I don't quite believe that, but anyway, we do know about the demand for on-demand services, sort of like Lyft and Uber. We know that in both, and there's also something called Zipcar, which you probably know. So in both cases, customers don't have the headaches of ownership and things like parking, and that's what people like. And these services operate through a smartphone, including booking and paying and so on and so forth. But this particular paper we looked at related to autonomous vehicles talks about shared autonomous vehicles, SAVs. This is where, say, a company would own the vehicles, preferably e-vehicles. And this sort of structure can have major implications for car ownership, for congestion, for VMT, for safety, and of course, greenhouse gases, if they're all electric and they run on zero carbon electricity. So this particular paper that we chose talks about all the benefits of SAVs, and you can see that, they could drive more efficiently, they can come closer together, they can drive at the same speed, they can avoid traffic congestion, they can be used to accelerate the adoption of e-vehicles because you can do it as a fleet, and in particular, they can charge in alignment with renewable electricity generation. So what this study does is they also use an energy system optimization model that separates these SAVs from privately owned vehicles, even if these vehicles are electric. And they basically provide 10 scenarios that they have with and without carbon taxes and so on. And as the scenarios are all located in Texas, which right now has high wind energy possibilities, and they're expecting the PV supply to keep increasing and their costs to keep decreasing, so that PV will dominate the supply mix in 2050 and therefore also increase the value of charging during the day. So this then makes it very attractive for SAVs, where charging can be optimized, curtailment might be minimized of the PV, and battery capacity might even be reduced if these SAVs can provide flexible charging load. So the conclusion from this particular paper, and in all scenarios, is that SAVs, eSAVs, can save greenhouse gases even if they double VMT of the vehicles they replace. And so their recommendations or the implications of this is that policymakers should put in place the regulations and the infrastructure to support SAV expansion, especially in the short to medium term, because they can be a very powerful way to decarbonize quicker. Next slide, please. So the next area of discussion in the literature is about freight systems, and we don't talk about that all too much here, although we do have a lot of it here. And this paper, or the papers we looked at, are looking at a literature review of other studies, looking at systems dynamics models that are used to address freight decarbonization in many countries. And although they find that the models address really only a very limited number of strategies, and they're especially weak on how this change should take place over time because the freight systems are much more inert than the passenger vehicle system, still they make a couple of observations. So there are 4 sub-pathways in freight system decarb, and that is reducing demand. It's similar to the one for passenger vehicles, but reducing demand. And they found, what does that mean? It means you minimize the physical amount of goods to be delivered by making products last longer, recycle, digitize, and designing goods with less material and increasing the price. Those are ways to decrease demand, but they found that this is nearly impossible because there's a huge focus on consumption. And not only that, there's an increase in population, and the investments in road infrastructure help to maintain the levels of freight demand on the roads. And they also found that price increases in fuel really didn't make much of a difference to freight demand. So the second way of decarbonizing freight is to shift to lower carbon transportation modes. And in this case, it means shifting from road to electric rail. This is very good for other countries. You all know that we have a problem here in San Diego with our rail falling off the cliff here. That's the rail that brings us our freight, moves our freight. So rail is much more efficient than truck, so ship. And they suggest that you can use a carbon tax to move the freight mode, say from road to rail. The other area that can be used is to increase energy efficiency of the freight system, moving the same amount of freight with the same amount of infrastructure, or moving more goods with the same energy and infrastructure by optimizing loads among companies, asset sharing, sharing warehouses, and so on, improving driver behavior, renewing the fleet faster, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there is a way to do something with alternative fuels, although this is also still rather undeveloped. There is currently a DOE research program into using e-methanol for ships. And I know this because Scripps Institution of Oceanography is just looking at building a new ship, and they were just considering use of how this would affect their operations. And the next area, please, the next slide. Okay, so this brings us, the question of consumption and increasing consumption brings us to the whole discussion in the literature about the limits of transportation electrification. So first, this particular study that we chose shows the immense difficulty of decarbonizing transportation because we are so dependent on it, and we have created a system that really depends on these fuels for cars, trucks, ships, and planes. And it's also possibly the least diversified of energy end-use sectors. There's increasing demand globally for mobility, and there are technical limitations on the options to replace oil. So the IPCC has found that if we follow current trends in this, especially GHG emissions from transport will increase faster than from any other area. This study also points out that we may have reached the limits of fuel efficiency of vehicles. They say that because they say, look at the Dieselgate scandal and look at the stories they tell about fuel economy. It's not really what's written on the tag. And then we have a huge issue with equity in transportation. These are all very difficult to model. And so they're saying that the models are really unrealistic because they're using massive technological change and assumptions of future technologies like CCS, like hydrogen, which are not only relatively uncertain, but we're assuming that they will be available commercially at huge levels and sustainable levels, and that these assumptions are questionable. So this increasing body of research is showing that without very strong behavioral changes, this crisis won't go away, and the GHG emissions reductions, particularly in transportation, will be very hard to achieve. And so this particular group, Blas et al. 2020, models 4 scenarios. 3 of them are growth scenarios with all the changes we have, and 1 is a degrowth scenario. And what they find that it is only in the degrowth paradigm that we will be able to achieve the reductions we need. And the degrowth paradigm is quick and radical shift to light EVs and non-motorized modes, and a drastic reduction in total transportation demand. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Thank you. These are the references if you want to look at those papers.
Thank you, Dr. Silvas. And I have a couple of questions for you on, thank you for that literature review on both demand and supply side. But, you covered a vast expanse from passenger and freight mobility and the global supply chain. So I wanted to ask you, in looking at this literature review in terms of our gaps in our knowledge base, if there are case studies from outside our region that we could learn from, and kind of if there are lessons that we can adopt for our San Diego region.
There are definitely lessons we can learn for our region. I think this shared autonomous vehicles, like the e-vehicles, I actually experienced that in Berlin a few months ago. They've been experimenting with these e-vehicles. It was so easy. These e-vehicles are charged with solar during the day. And basically it's like using a zip car, but it's e-vehicles, and you just get one near your place and you drop it off near your place. They have the parking arrangements all figured out. These are urbanized areas. So I think that's, for example, one thing that we could look at doing in our urbanized areas. There's also the research into alternatives for ships and for rail. We do have a huge issue with rail that I think we really have to resolve, because otherwise we won't even have rail in our area, and we'll be moving that freight onto road trucks, which will increase our air pollution with road trucks, and also our greenhouse gas emissions, and increase traffic in areas of concern that we already have. So I think there are a couple of things that we can address urgently in the region, and other ideas we can take from outside.
Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that you teach international law at the University of San Diego School of Law, and as we're exploring this regional model, we are also connected to in both in terms of trade as well as in terms of pollution to our borders, to neighbors to the south of us and around the world. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of regional collaboration, as we think of partnership with other players around the world and in the transportation sector, what potential role do you see the county playing in bringing everyone to the table to have this kind of discussion on regional action for decarbonization in transportation?
Yeah, so I mean, our border region is the ideal test bed, I think, for regional collaboration, but cross-border with Mexico related to the trucks. I mean, we have something like 2 million trucks crossing in every direction. I think that was in 2019. So we have that situation because we've opened up our economies, so Canada, US, and Mexico through NAFTA, but even much before that, open it up to trade, where we've been using this economic paradigm that we should produce the goods in places where it's cheaper to produce or where there's a competitive advantage and so on. And the US can sell its goods and services in those other countries. So this is the final result of this kind of an opening. And I think we need to, I mean, I agree with the last academic approach, is that we sort of have to rethink this approach to dealing with each other across the borders. But as far as the county is concerned, they could, I think, start, or maybe they already have a discussion with across the border and the transportation companies and how you can improve the efficiencies, like with sharing warehouses or finding those efficiencies, helping trucks on the other side to become more fuel efficient, for example, and figuring out those kind of interactions at a small level, not the global level. I think there are opportunities.
Thank you so much. And that concludes your presentation. We appreciate your time here.
Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Jim Messner. And Jim, I need to apologize to you in advance because some of these acronyms in your resume this is a different, unique world for us. It's really, we really appreciate as a county that Qualcomm is having its best minds come here and share the knowledge with us. So Jim is a senior director of product management and global V2X ecosystem lead for Qualcomm, and develops and executes the CV2X deployment strategy across all global regions. Prior to that, at Qualcomm, he led the automotive standards team. Jim serves as a 5GAA board member, an ITS California board member, the SAEC V2X technical committee chair, is on the IEEE ITS Society Board of Governors. He's also active in the transportation board. Jim serves as an advisory council member to Mobility 21, led by Carnegie Mellon University. He was a pioneer in vehicle highway automation and vehicle safety communication at the California Partners for Advanced Transit and Highways at UC Berkeley. He also served as the PATH executive director, executive advisor to Booz Allen Hamilton, and as an independent consultant. He holds a BS and MS degrees from UCLA, as well as USC. Go Trojan. All right, Jim.
Hi, thank you very much. And I will do my best to define acronyms as I go along. And just for the record, and no need to make apologies, my last name is pronounced Meisner, but that's an artifact of Ellis Island. It's not necessarily anything else. So let me preface this a little bit. And I was fascinated by this topic and fascinated by the previous speakers' remarks. I'm going to do some baselining. And first of all, is technology is not a panacea. Technology is an instrument of policy. And while I'm not going to have explicit words on policy, I note that we have legacy policies in land use. And we have potential future policies in demand management that includes pricing. And also ways to encourage multimodalism and basically ways to make mode choices prior to or en route. And what glues this all together, and the thesis of which I will expand on, is that connectivity and certainly is here and now. So while I'll talk a little bit aspirationally about some technologies, I want to note that most of you have very high-end computer and connectivity devices in your pockets, in your purses. And this type of connectivity, when you start to put that into personal mobility, the way you and I travel, and to put this into what's called transportation system management operations, and you marry that to policy, one can start to get this promise of decarbonization or start to go on that road, figuratively, literally, to decarbonization quicker. And so, again, please keep that in mind. So I'm going to use some fancy words, but in the end, if you have this type of heterogeneous connectivity that's as ubiquitous as possible, and that's nearly there, and you start to marry this with some really smart policy, you can start to address mobility needs at the same time as you start to address the decarbonization needs that we all need. So enough of that. That's a little bit off topic, but hopefully it sets perhaps level sets where I'm coming from, and hopefully it brings me to the level that you're on. So if you go to the next slide, please. And so this kind of says some of what I said, but perhaps in pretty pictures rather than flowery words. And you know, you'll hear this term, and I promise that I'll make definitions along the way, although I only have a few minutes. So V2X is vehicle to everything, and I'll define that a little bit later. But V to everything means a whole bunch of things, everything, right? So the connectivity that you and I might have when we're close together for safety is V2X, the connectivity that you have to the network in order to understand basically what that traffic is, or maybe what some of the modal alternatives are so you can switch modes mid-route, is also V2X, and everything in between. And certainly we have, and you all are part of the 5G revolution. And there are lots of ways to describe 5G, but another one very simple way is it's a big pipe, and it's a very efficient pipe. And therefore, there's more information that could be broadcast or unicast in a larger range in a shorter period of time. So you start to get into, this is when I talk about heterogeneity, you start to get into interesting services, and this is a potpourri here that you see on this slide. So there's certainly safety, the short range, and then there's a teleoperation was first to get into this, and I'm not saying this is here and now, I'm saying the connectivity is, but you start to get into various interesting ways of having AVs, which is, I saw Sanjeev Nada's comments that are different than connected vehicles. And I'm here primarily to talk about connected vehicles, but you can see how connectivity can kind of facilitate these near-term and longer-term services, which in total sum up to more efficient travel, not more efficient journeys, but more efficient travel in total, so that you can start to have these types of alternatives up to and including delaying or not having your trip. So this whole idea of a connected highway, certainly the 4G and 5G networks, the CV2X, which I'll talk a little bit about, and because this is a slide that I give and say different words to different people, precise positioning means something more to safety than it does to the gist of this talk. Next slide, please. And so this is just an illustration of what I said before, so I won't belabor it. But I just want to add one point, and I know this is conjecture, and I can actually, given if you press me against the wall, can talk about the literature because I'm quite familiar with it, about the relationship between safety and mobility, or actually congestion. And you know, and I don't need to belabor this also, there's a strong relationship between congestion and emissions. Ergo, if you have a safer vehicle or safer transportation system, you have fewer recurring incidents. Some people conjecture, and again, there's a literature that shows that about 50% of congestion is caused by non-recurring incidents. So if you eliminate crashes, and we want to, or mitigate or ameliorate the crash volume and the crash problem, you start to get into a more efficient roadways, which leads to safer. Remember, I talked about heterogeneity. This is at the point of play right here. When you take it back into network communications, you know, do you even have to go on that trip that was dangerous? Can you use another mode? Can that mode perhaps be transit? Those are all sorts of things that we can talk about. But suffice it to say, if you have these types of links, vehicle to vehicle, again, I started the slide by talking about safety, vehicle infrastructure, vehicle pedestrian, these are all interesting direct communication modes, which is the CV2X I normally talk about to quite technical audiences and to car companies. But when I talk more broadly and we live this, we have the V2N. And this is, the sum total is, it's a pretty neat system that addresses safety. I showed you or talked about the link between safety and congestion, and it enhances tremendously personal mobility. And if you're running a regional traffic management operation, it would also allow you to have that type of information that you need to start to enact the types of policies, not just on-ramp meters, but certainly you can even do pricing policies, all sorts of interesting policies that are really outside the scope of me to talk about in PowerPoint, but in the scope of the conversation we all must have. Next slide, please. And so this is that short range communication, and I don't need to talk about this because there's some complicated terms about spectrum, gigahertz. But suffice it to say, at the kind of frequencies we have at Wi-Fi, you can start to do this short range communication. What's really important when I talk about this is that this seems pie in the sky, but it really isn't. It's pretty much something that we at Qualcomm have in our products. OEMs want it, depending on what part of the world you're in, and we're on the cusp of having this in the US. So again, I make that safety. Safety is important. It addresses all sorts of interesting aspects, and I made that link, although perhaps not, you know, in the proof point, that it does relate to congestion, which does relate to decarbonization. So again, let's go to the next slide. This slide isn't as important as the overall concept. So what happens when you have this type of connectivity? And I've given you some round numbers, but you know, citations are fairly easy. For example, if you look at the environment, which is the topic of the day, actually it should be the topic of the century for all of us, the up to 20% reduction in CO2 emissions actually comes from a host of studies, one of which is at CE CERT at UC Riverside, by Professor Matt Barth. Another comes from Hesham Rocco, who we engage in at Virginia Tech, a group, an acronym that we talked about in the introduction, the 5G Automotive Association, or 5GA, has contacted a Dutch research organization. And we've shown in a literature search that this is a pretty good number. When you have this type of connectivity, you have the efficiencies that I touched on, and you can, with more efficient traffic operations and technology that's really here and now, you can start to affect this type of environmental benefit, which starts to get into the reason that we're meeting here. And I related that to efficiency. I haven't really focused on equity, but equity is pretty important since the underserved suffer disproportionately with safety for sure, but certainly with environmental effects. So if you start to address all of these with the type of different types of links for communication, CV2X does benefit society and the environment. By the way, we at Qualcomm have written a white paper that talks about the benefits of CV2X or V2X, this connectivity that transcends safety, that addresses environment and other types of issues to include equity. So, hopefully the thesis and this initial conclusion is fairly clear. Go to the next slide, please. So this is, again, a general slide, but you can kind of see, certainly this is not the San Diego region, my apologies, but you can see that the types of movement made to at least instantiate one aspect of this, which is that it's ready for deployment. The aspect that's not on this slide, which really should be the final word that I have here, is that we all have, again, in our pockets, a mobile phone or purses. Many of us have in our cars this type of telematics connectivity or network access. That is, you have a modem, you have a way to be connected. And when you sum all this up and put this in a sensitive way, policy-oriented way, you can start to have the types of efficiencies that we need in transportation, up to and again, including not doing a personal automobile travel. And you can start to yield this type of these types of benefits. And again, it all comes with the fact that you need this type of information flow, which connectivity affords. That's my last slide, and certainly happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jim. I will ask you a question that builds up primarily on this technology in terms of, you said it's ready for deployment, and with the information that you have, the technology that you're working with, are there specific ideas for or suggestions for action for there are several agencies here in this room and will be watching this presentation for us to do as public agencies.
And certainly I can do this and address some of the very good comments I see in the chat in one fell swoop. Note that I talked about everyone in this panel or in this audience having a cell phone in the pocket. I understand and very sensitive to the fact that not all of us do, but enough of us do that one can enact these types of transportation system management operations. It could still enact some policies based on sourcing those that do. And so while not everyone can yield personal benefits, there is marginal benefit to everyone given this type of connectivity. So I would encourage policymakers and the audiences to think about the tools that you have. This is not certainly there are many, many vendors out there. But the fact is that if one has information at your fingertips, then one can enact the policies that you want. So again, use the types of connectivity that exist today and the travelers that may have them to benefit the larger population.
Thank you, Jim. And from an individual level and consumer perspective, are there gaps in our knowledge about or potential technological advances that that we don't know about yet that we should be planning for?
Well, I did talk about this V2X, which may be a new term for many of you. Comes off my tongue rather easily. But think about it more broadly than sometimes even I use it. Think about the fact that one needs to have basically this ubiquitous communication. You can leverage that. So the gap in our knowledge is really the understanding of how to leverage what we have right now. one little gap in their knowledge that is pretty important and actually essential for public sector policymakers to really understand is the idea of trackability and privacy. And again, this is a long discussion, but one can separate that from the individual. So what we're trying to do is provide this type of aggregated crowd information to allow better transportation operations, ultimately to enact the types of policies that we're considering.
Thank you, Jim. And one final question, which I ask every panelist, is what can the county do in bringing together different stakeholders and players to the table for regional action on decarbonizing the transportation sector?
You know, that is a difficult and very good question, and one that I humbly say that I can't answer that well, but let me make an attempt. Is that remember, and you've read my resume, that almost everything I see is the litmus of transportation and technology. So I noticed that when you talk about the food system, or when you talk about land use, the tying theme is everything needs to be moved, right? Goods movement. So in the end, you know, the fact that things need to be moved brings everything into common denominators, that if you start to address these efficiencies or inefficiencies in our transportation system, it benefits other segments.
Thank you very much for your time, Jim. Really
Oh,
appreciate
you're
you
welcome.
coming here and joining us.
Well, it's my
And-
honor and privilege.
Thank you.
Pleasure, actually.
And
Thank you.
our final stakeholder presentation today is from Kyle Hiskala. Kyle is a climate justice policy advocate with the Environmental Health Coalition, where he works on environmental justice issues to integrate their voices and ideas for communities and bringing them into local, regional, and state levels of government. Kyle, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Murtaza. Yes, as Murtaza mentioned, I'm with Environmental Health Coalition, and many of you are familiar with our work. So I'll try and focus the bulk of the conversation on the transportation work that we're doing. So next slide, please. Today we'll cover the context very quickly, environmental justice, then dive into some of the problems, and then look at some of the solutions. Next slide. So for the context, environmental justice communities in San Diego that Environmental Health Coalition does community organizing in include City Heights, Barrio Logan, Logan Heights, Sherman Heights, West National City, and of course, over the border, we also have work in Colonia Chilpancingo. Next. Quick refresher for those of you who are not familiar, this is what environmental injustice looks like for communities that are bearing the greatest burden of polluting industries, living next to ports, toxic waste facilities, heavy duty trucks. So this is the reality of what our overburdened communities look like, overpolluted communities look like. Next slide. And then measuring the health disparity in EJ communities is one of the clearest examples of where air quality results in asthma rates that are disproportionate. So Logan has an asthma rate that is 3 times higher than the San Diego County average. Next slide. So some of the problems that we're seeing in terms of transportation. The first problem is an obvious one, that California's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. So almost about half of all of our emissions. Next slide. The problem number 2 that we wanted to, I always try to raise this up in every space that I'm in, is that electric vehicles alone cannot be a solution to decarbonizing the transportation sector, due to the fact that there's extreme costs from a climate perspective and carbon emissions on the manufacturing and disposal of electric vehicles. So if you compare the carbon intensity per passenger kilometer of these different modes, You look at the bottom where we have light rail with overhead lines, electric buses. Those are way more climate efficient forms of transportation. And so in terms of limited time and limited resources, we really have to focus in on what we're going to be able to get the biggest climate benefit for our dollars. Next slide. And then the last problem I wanted to highlight is that the metals that are required for the manufacturing of vehicles are extremely destructive and costly to the people and the planet. So indigenous populations in South America, or even populations of low-income communities living in Imperial Valley, living next to lithium deposits, are going to bear the burden of our economic and systemic choices. So I just want us to bear that in mind, that an electric battery for an electric bus is going to move a lot more people over its lifetime than an electric car battery in a car that might move a far fewer number of people over its lifetime. Next. So to get into some of the solutions, the environmental justice outreach that we do time and time again, clean air, transportation, and housing come up the most when we talk about climate change and the problems that environmental justice communities are facing. Next slide. So the solution that we continually come back to is that communities who cannot afford, or families who can't afford to buy an electric car today, who are transit dependent today, will be transit dependent 10 years from now. So it's important for us to figure out solutions for transit dependent communities, and that's where we need to start. And of course, we have to go beyond just transit dependent communities and figure out ways to expand and improve the transit network to get more people on board. Next slide. Environmental justice organizations created a coalition, the Transportation Equity Working Group. I know some of the organizations on this call are involved, but this was a highly community-driven process with community members on the ground who were able to develop what their priorities are. I'm not going to read all of these off, but just to name a few: Blue Line Express, bus service every 10 minutes, bathrooms, a purple line, 24-hour service, electric buses. Like, these are grounded in community priorities. So if we're thinking about where governments can focus, here's the list directly for you all to prioritize. Next. I think I'm going to skip over this mostly, but I just wanted to highlight that there's some modeling that has been done through the California Transportation Plan 2050. And it requires us to look beyond it, but we've been advocating at the state level for a 25% reduction per capita in vehicle miles traveled by the year 2030. That represents, if we were to look at the lens of public transportation, about $70 billion over the next 8 years coming from the state and federal sources to invest in mass transit. Next slide. This is a final slide. I just wanted to leave you all with what prioritizing environmental justice communities looks like. EJ communities are consulted first and remain at the table. The clean air strategies that we all know about in our region are integrated into climate policies. And fast, reliable, and affordable public mass transit, of course, is key. Affordable housing must be paired with anti-displacement, and equity funding commitments need to be in climate plans, not just statements about equity, but following up with commitments to funding, and then investing in transit and EJ communities first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Really appreciate all the work that Environmental Health Coalition is doing in our environmental justice communities in the region, and for all the insight that you provided as we are developing a social equity-centered regional decarbonization framework. I want to ask you because you presented some of this potential solution on prioritizing EJ communities. And especially when you talked about transit dependent communities and expanding the transit outside the areas that are currently served, do you have specific ideas or suggestions for action in terms of that approach towards expanding the use of transit?
I think that there's, it's like a multi-stepped process that takes place over a long period of time. And I think I was trying to express how important it is to invest in mass transit in environmental justice communities first. If we think about where do we want to improve our existing system, that's where the dollars should go first. The other ideas that exist are really laid out in the 10 transit lifelines. There's a video there that can there's 10 videos for each of the lifelines that illustrates everything from expanded frequency to express services, 24-hour services. That's a really great place to come back to.
Thank you, Kyle. My next question is about heavy duty ZEVs, the drayage trucks, and I know you're partnering with other regional agencies as well. In terms of the gaps in our knowledge base, because we're trying to see how we can expand our worldview, our methods of thinking. Are there case studies from outside our region that we can learn from for future action and inspiration?
In terms of heavy duty electrification?
Yeah, trucks and freight and drayage trucks.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of work happening at the port of Long Beach, and California is sort of a trailblazer when it comes to electrification of heavy duty vehicles and drayage. And the Port of San Diego is really a trailblazer, and the California Air Resources Board is doing extensive research and analysis on what kind of technologies and programs and regulations need to be put in place. There's actually a hearing going on at this very moment at the Air Resources Board looking at the Advanced Clean Fleets rule. So I think in terms of this region, we can really lean heavily on the experts at the state level with the Air Resources Board.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you for joining us while that hearing is also an important one going on right now. So my final question is about regional collaboration. You touched on several sectors, including housing and land use and air quality. So what potential role do you see the county playing in bringing everyone to the table for regional action?
Yeah, that's a really great idea and a really great concept. So some of the work that we did with the City of San Diego's Climate Action Plan update was we worked to pull in the air quality goals that were developed in the Community Emissions Reduction Plan that was developed with APCD, the Port of San Diego, the City of San Diego, City of National City for the portside communities. And we really strengthened the clean air section in the City of San Diego's Climate Action Plan. But that is just a plan, and in order to implement that, the county as a regional partner can really play an important role as a convener, bringing the port and APCD and the City of San Diego together as they work on projects to implement the actual plans on the books. So there's new frontiers being discovered in terms of decarbonizing transportation and advancing clean technologies. It's kind of forcing government agencies that have never worked together before to work together. And I think that that's where additional capacity and coordination and sharing best practices will be really helpful, so that if the city of San Diego is successful in strengthening its clean air section and finding ways to partner with the air pollution control district, can that be shared with other cities and other municipalities that are working on centering environmental justice in their climate plan, so that we're not thinking only about greenhouse gases, but we're thinking about clean air as it is impacting our most over-polluted communities, because clean air is good climate policy.
Thank you very much. With that final note, clean air is good climate policy. Those are the three ideas for today. We need to move on after this to the implementation playbook component of what we're doing with the University of San Diego Energy Policy Initiative Center. And we've discussed this earlier. We intended to present this implementation playbook in spring of next year. And in order to develop this, we first will draw out actions that each organization, businesses, and governments can do on their own. Second, building up on those actions, we will explore community-wide actions that local and tribal governments can adopt. And third, because emissions know no boundaries, we will identify those from a regional perspective where we can gain efficiencies and greater outcomes for more collective impact. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott. I see a few hands raised. As soon as Scott is done, we will take feedback on the implementation playbook shortly. Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you, Murtaza, and thanks again to all the presenters. Really interesting and inspiring information in those presentations. I just wanted to provide a little bit of a context for the information that you may have seen. We're putting together draft lists of actions in all of these categories that we're talking about, and wanted to kind of give you some insight and context about what it is you're seeing and kind of how we thought about it. One of the key ways we've organized the actions in the playbook is by how they're implemented, and how they're implemented can affect cost or greenhouse gas reduction or time needed to implement. And so these are the 8 areas. So analysis and research, capital projects, basically building something, education, incentives can be financial or otherwise, partner, collaborate, plan or strategy, program, and then requirement policy. And there is some logic to this, or could be logic kind of applied to this, where it's a bit of a process where you have an analysis and research kind of phase where you look at a particular or analyze a particular question or challenge, do some research, and based on that, develop plans or programs, or maybe a plan or a strategy. That plan or strategy may comprise projects or education and outreach campaigns, incentives, et cetera, and policies. And so there's a bit of a logic or a bit of a process embedded in here. But in any case, these are generally kind of how we've categorized the policies we have internally, and then in the playbook as well. Next slide. So I alluded to this early, but we have 3 criteria that we're applying to the actions in the playbook at this point. One is greenhouse gas reduction potential, one is cost, and one is time to implement. In terms of the greenhouse gas reduction potential, these are relative greenhouse gas reductions compared to other actions. And I should clarify that when we talk about relative comparisons for the purposes of the playbook, we're going to be comparing within the scale. And it's possible that the relative comparison is the same through all scales, but we just want to make sure that we're not comparing planting 1 tree in the parking lot of a particular organization to planting 1 million trees in the region of San Diego, or some other measure that's being done at the regional scale. We also wanted to clarify that there will be some actions that have no greenhouse gas reduction potential in the playbook, and those are things like education, research and analysis, those kinds of things. Those can be thought of as kind of supporting activities that are necessary, but they don't directly lead to reductions. So for example, It's likely that an education campaign leads to some reductions, just difficult to kind of connect the dots. Whereas there are certain other actions that are either very clearly directly reduce emissions, or there's a methodology to figure that out, like the potential impact of adding bike lanes. Next bullet. Next bullet, please. So the time to complete, again, it's relative. One action compared to another, that this is the time it would take to complete an action. So for example, to carry on the analogy or the example, it's quicker to add a page to a website than it is to build a bike lane. So we would just differentiate in terms of the time it would take to complete a particular activity. Next bullet. And then the cost to implement, again, similarly, it's the relative cost to implement an action. Cheaper to add a page to a website than it is to build bike lanes. And one thing I'll say about all of these, but in particular the cost, is that we're really talking about kind of categories of actions, because we don't really know what the specific action or activity is in this case, right? This is just a playbook. How something gets implemented would ultimately determine all three of these criteria. So for example, if you did a building analysis so we wanted to know something about the existing buildings in San Diego, and we just went to existing sources, existing literature, and pulled together a summary and called that our analysis. That's a very different effort than doing a ground up building by building analysis, which might take much longer and cost much more. So we don't know which one of those things would happen. So we're trying to think about kind of averages within here. It's just, it's an initial thought or an initial screening criteria here. Next slide. So I got ahead of myself. We're talking here about kind of preliminary estimates, right? So averages, if you will, across the category. Can't possibly comment on all the actions. And it's really just intended as an initial screening for decision making. And then real analysis, and I think these are important questions, but the greenhouse gas potential and the cost implications really have to be derived from the specific action that might be taken. At this point, we're just trying to create kind of a list of possibilities, an idea bank, as Murtaza has put it. So yeah, initial preliminary screening here. And then, go ahead, next slide. Thank you for pushing me along here. We also recognize that there are other co-benefits. I think Kyle stated it pretty clearly at the end of his presentation that good air quality policy is good climate policy. And so we recognize that there are potentially many, many other benefits to doing the kinds of actions that you'll see in the playbook. But the primary concern of the regional decarbonization framework is greenhouse gas emissions. We will acknowledge and talk about those other things as well, including workforce and equity kinds of concerns. But again, we're kind of focusing in on the decarbonization task before us. So with that, Murtaza, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Scott. I'll just go over the materials we sent out prior to this meeting. This is a matrix of transportation-related measures from the EPIC database, which has been derived from climate action plans, as well as feedback received during our first workshop where possible. This is available for comment directly under the document review tab in the Engage platform, and we invite you to provide initial comments and feedback on these tables so that you can better inform the development of our implementation playbook draft. The two categories for organizations here are reduced vehicle miles traveled, driven, and alternate fuel vehicles. And then the categories there, I don't need to cover it because Scott just went over it. I think we can keep moving on that. Community. So this slide shows a similar matrix at the community scale. The categories include, once again, vehicle miles driven and alternate fuel vehicles, as well as reduced fuel. And finally, on the region, this is where we're looking at it from a regional angle. Besides the transportation planning, which I know some of the questions that will come up on this, it's difficult to think about how transportation can be addressed, even though it is single largest remaining emitter in each of our climate action plans, but we will get there. The only category in this right now is reduced vehicle miles driven. So we want to fill this out. We want ideas from you. This is where we would really appreciate your input. As I mentioned earlier, you can use the Engage platform. You can email us, message us, use this forum to raise your hand if you want to come on audio. And of course, you feel to put in any of the research or ideas you have in the chat, because we're taking it, capturing it, and transmitting it directly to our team so that they can cross-reference what we have in our database. So to remind us, the 3 questions are up here. What we are looking for today is what works and does not work based on your experience. Second, what are the impacts on disadvantaged communities, both positive and negative? And third, what are we missing? This could include research and development, implementation plans, financial incentives, workforce training, etc. And with that, thank you so much for your patience. I appreciate Sanjeev, Craig, Sandra, you've been waiting for a bit to come on the audio. So if you are ready, I'll call for Sanjeev first.
Great. Thank you so much, Murtaza. So glad to participate in this transportation working group. Just by way of introduction, I'm somewhat of an expert at autonomous and connected vehicles, having worked at Qualcomm on these topics, and also a bit on shared vehicles, having worked at Sandag on this. And I just wanted to kind of highlight and make sure that we don't conflate autonomous, shared, and connected, and electric, and so on and so forth. I really feel that it's intentional that people conflate these. Autonomous is sexy. It's this bright, shiny object, and I worked on autonomous for that reason, partly. And it's well funded, and so there's academic funding available, and so academics work on it. And I think autonomous vehicles have been shown by academic studies to actually increase VMT for not very sophisticated reasons. I mean, if you have an autonomous vehicle, you're probably going to live further away because it's comfortable to just go anywhere. And autonomous vehicles will travel with 0 passengers. And so there's a big body of literature that says private autonomous vehicles are going to be worse for congestion and VMT. So I think it's really important to not get, look at the shiny object and think of autonomous vehicles as some holy grail. And so I know it was, the papers published on shared autonomous vehicles and electric and so on and so forth, but they try to benefit from the benefits of shared and electric to hide the benefits, to hide the downsides of autonomy. I mean, the benefits of autonomy for safety are really important, but we shouldn't get carried away and wait for autonomy to help us with shared and electric, which can help our communities now. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop because I want to give other people an opportunity. So thank you.
Also, thank you so much, Sanjeev. And if there's any further information, please feel free to either email or put in the chat. Sanjeev's point is whether autonomous vehicles are really a solution for decarbonizing transportation. And that's an open question, right? So with that, I'll move on to Craig.
Thank you, Murtaza. I appreciate it. Very detailed presentations. So I took some time to review the materials ahead of time and have a couple of comments on the matrix form, that is the kind of the spreadsheet. First of all, I don't see where the various points taken or activities are assigned to who would implement them. And I think that needs to be addressed in this work. We need to be very clear on that. I have been looking for explicit activities to address the relationship between land use and transportation related emissions, specifically avoiding making sure that we avoid sprawl. Some of the activities outlined here pussyfoot around it, but I think it needs to be addressed more explicitly, and what can be done to make sure that we absolutely stop sprawling. If we have time, can you bring back your list of the 3 questions that started off our discussion here? Because I have one more thing to say based on those.
Sure, we can put those questions up back up.
And I'll try to be brief here. So what has worked and not worked in terms of existing policies? What programs could benefit underserved? What has not worked to date has been government action that's been aggressive enough. So many of us in the community here have very high hopes about the regional decarbonization framework, but it has to translate quickly into specific actions, specific government actions. So we're hoping that this moves quickly, gets very specific, and includes some things that can be done now and not with years out timeframes. You know, unfortunately, the activities and the policies of local government, in my view, have been too influenced in the past by private self-serving profit motives. We need to stop thinking that way and thinking in terms of the overall public good. Anyway, so those are how I address these 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I'll just briefly give an overview of our process so far. So we are at this point developing the implementation playbook, and that is intended to be a resource for any of the public agencies, including cities, businesses, and individuals. From the guide that we come up with, the roadmap, we will be looking for regional actions. And with all these actions, we would be going to the board in spring for approval. So there's a little bit of time for your input in terms of what action should be taken, and at the same time, kind of to be mindful that the implementation playbook itself is not a plan. It is a resource for anyone to use. So thank you for putting that up. Thank you for putting this timeline up. I think we have a few people waiting, so I'll go to Sandra. Oh, also I want to thank you, Craig, for actually studying the list, because that's very helpful for you if you can provide us feedback on what we should be filling in. Appreciate that. All right, Sandra, go ahead.
Hi, I am Sandra Stahl. I'm with Clean Earth for Kids, and thank you so much for the presentations on decarbonization. It's very, very important area of protecting our planet, giving us clean air. I participated in the initial meeting to help establish community participation in the process of establishing the County Office of Environmental and Climate Justice. I gotta say, I'm perplexed and distressed in that it appears the whole focus appears to be on decarbonization instead of also including other dangerous environmental toxins in the air. Specifically, my main concern is toxic lead air pollution resulting from the exclusive sale of leaded aviation fuel at San Diego County-owned airports. 2 in particular, Gillespie Field and McClellan Palomar Airport, both of which are on the list of the 100 top lead-producing airports in the nation. Now, a Duke University study found that children living near general aviation airports have higher blood lead levels. An MIT study found that childhood IQ losses attributed to toxic leaded aviation fuel contributes to $1.06 billion in annual damages from lifetime earnings reductions due to lower IQs. The County of San Diego has a moral obligation to protect the children who live near county airports from IQ loss that will affect the rest of their lives. And IQ loss doesn't mean, that they're in special ed just 1 or 2 drops in IQ can result in all sorts of learning problems. Now, a recent study commissioned by the County of Santa Clara on lead exposure risks for children living in the area around Reed Hillview Airport in East San Jose found that the continued use of leaded aviation fuel has contributed to increased blood lead levels, particularly for those within a half mile of the facility. So the question is this panel going to only focus on decarbonization, or will a solution to cut the toxic lead air pollution from general aviation as much as possible in the county also be considered a priority? You know, the city of San Diego has stepped up to the plate. We'll soon start offering unleaded avgas at Montgomery Gibbs Executive Airport. Money for an unleaded fuel tank was included in Mayor Gloria's budget this year, and the airport's in the process of clearing land to lay a concrete slab for the unleaded fuel tank. So the question is, will the County of San Diego also step up to the plate and do the same at Gillespie Field and McClellan Palomar Airport? A recommendation to offer unleaded avgas at those 2 airports specifically from the County Office of Environmental and Climate Justice is really needed. So I'd just kind of like to know, you know, the answer to my question, is this panel only going to focus on decarbonization, or are other solutions to cut toxic air pollution also going to be considered? Thank you.
Sandra, I'll just briefly address it before I turn it over to you, Carl. And the purpose of today's workshop is on decarbonization of the transportation sector from a regional scale. And then within the issues that you're addressing regarding air pollution and those direct actions that the county could take as its own municipality, those would be addressed by different departments within the county. So I want to help you connect you to all the departments so that you can make sure that your concerns are heard and addressed. So we'll gladly facilitate that from the Luge Executive Office.
Okay, I appreciate that. I guess my question is, will this particular panel make any recommendations regarding that?
Okay, so Sandra, the purpose of the working group is to help draft the implementation playbook, and that playbook is being, as the board approved, 4 sectors plus 1. Transportation is one of the key sectors where the research that was done prior to this in terms of the technical study by UCSD that showed where the emissions are coming from. We're trying to build up on policies to address those emissions. So that is the purpose of this, is to address decarbonization of transportation emissions so that we can get to net zero emissions by mid-century or sooner. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Carl. Go ahead, Carl.
Thank you. I want to drop a quote here from Gustavo Petra, the former mayor of Bogota, Colombia, and now the president. A developed country is not a place where the poor have cars. It's where the rich use public transportation. I fully understand that we're a very car-dependent society right now. But that did happen in a short period of time, from the beginning of the 20th century to World War II. We still didn't have that much car dependency. And then following World War II, things really took off and we began to become very dependent on cars. And there's a path for us to unwind all that. And I think it's very clear if you look at other societies who are investing heavily in public transportation, rail in particular, electrified rail, and combining that with active transportation. A lot of the problems that we're discussing today are within our reach, things that we could really accomplish as opposed to cutting in small ways. So that transition from ICE cars to EV cars that's actually preventing us from making the transition to public transportation. And I just want to call that out. I think it's really important. I think Kyle, certainly alluded to that in his presentation, but I don't think that the RDF is describing that as a really critical path to what's it going to be like in 2050. If in 2050 we can't make any of these electric cars because they still require 42% of the emissions of a regular car, it's game over. And so we really need to be investing in regional rail and trams and trolleys now. And just, if you can't imagine that because you say to yourself, trains can't connect all the homes. Trains can go up any path that a car can go up. If you can build a road, you can build a train track. Now, that doesn't mean that it's practical to have trains running on every small road, but we need to be able to imagine much differently in how we're going to share our use of transportation, as opposed to still thinking that it's our right and privilege to use cars. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And if you have any suggestions, like if we're missing any specific actions on train system like that, especially as a region and as cities and agencies within the region that we should be working on and that are missing, please feel free to add and let us know. Thank you, Carl. Appreciate that. I see a couple of folks. Sandra, I assume that's a legacy hand. Okay. All right. I'll go to Sean. Go ahead, Sean.
Hey, Doctor, how you doing? And everybody.
Good.
Great presentation, everybody. My name is Sean Ellis. For those of you guys that don't know who I am a political organizer for the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union. So what does that mean to you guys when it comes to transportation? Well, that means we're those fossil fuel workers that are in danger of losing our industry, losing our jobs, our careers. So I want to begin to just say it was a great presentation. All right. But I would love to see more and begin that conversation of talking about renewable fuels. Items like hydrogen. I mean, we're talking a lot about electrification. I believe culturally we're heading that direction. And unfortunately for our members, we're converting fast. But for what it's worth, when we talk about inflation, when we talk about economical situations right now, I'm losing members to the cost of living, right? I am actually in another meeting. We just got done talking about project labor agreements at the Water Authority. And now we're worried about water rates rising and inflation is a serious issue right now, especially at the midterms, right? So that being said, when we talk about transportation, everybody, I live in Vista, California. I see my councilwoman right there, a great leader. And our community, we have to drive. It's almost, in a way, very respectfully, for those who believe in mass public transportation, it's almost insane to think that us in Vista, right now, we're all driving to work. It's what we can afford. It's what we can do. That commute from Vista to downtown San Diego can take hours, guys, hour and a half, 2 hours to get from my community to downtown. So I'm not against public transportation and mass transit. I'm for an all of the above approach to transportation. Let's not only provide electric trolleys, hydrogen trains, sustainable fuels for planes, but allow those renewable fuels for people like myself that don't want to get rid of my old car. I don't want to get rid of my old car. It's paid off. It's affordable. I can take care of my kids the lifestyle that I want, right? And so, we want battery cars, we want electric cars, we want windmills, we want solar, but we want the ability to take trash and create hydrogen, take landfills, a linear system, and actually create sustainable fuels so that we can use it in that 98 Corolla that you see rolling around Vista, California, or that 2013 truck. So that being said, I could talk for hours on the subject. I appreciate the time, Doctor, like always. And I'm always available for anybody that wants to have a cup of coffee and have these tough conversations. Like I said, we're not for a just transition for our workers. We're for an all of the above approach to all systems and all abilities to solve this climate. So thank you for your time, everybody. You guys have a beautiful evening.
Thank you, Sean. And would love to hear your thoughts on water as well another time. All right. Next is Corey.
Hi, I just wanted to mention, I don't believe that all of the mass transportation needs to be electrified, just with the ongoing cost of increasing costs of the metals, as well as in Europe. I believe that they're having some litigation issues regarding their electrification process and the controversy of how the metal is mined, what machines were used, what fuels were used, as well as the means of production there, in addition to forming all of the other different things which were on paper are the end product considered zero emission. They're considered renewable, but the process of getting those materials are not. I do believe that we need mass transit. I do believe that we need increased stops. I need increased population available, but I also believe that we need to get there sustainably and affordably. And current costs of lithium, for example, is like $77,000 a ton. So it's just not sustainable economically if we want to get to a deeper decarbonization. I am for the renewable fuels, and right now the studies are coming out that CCUS plus the biofuels, for example, from waste or feedstock, or the renewable types of feedstocks, are positioned to be the most effective. The COP27, I think they're discussing that the fossil fuels are not expected to be phased out, not even 60% into 2050. So in order to get there, we need to have farther reaching methods and more diverse methods of getting there, in addition to the renewable diesels, the sustainable aviation fuels, the renewable gasolines, and the biofuels to get there, which can bring everyone along. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. You had a pretty extensive list. Is it possible for you to just like email us or
Yeah.
put it on Engage?
Yep, I put in some of the sources on the chat. I'm not sure if it went through, but I could also email it.
Thank you. We're trying to capture it as you speak, but we want to make sure we have everything. And okay. Are you done, Corey?
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Sanjeev, is that a legacy hand, or do you want to come back on?
I wanted to come back on if I
Okay,
can get
go ahead.
another brief.
Go ahead.
So I'll be brief again. I think the three questions that you raised, I am a proponent of something called microtransit, and I put that in one of the comments in the matrix as well recently. But I just wanted to say that there's an opportunity for this group to, it addresses the three questions that you listed. It is thing that is missing in that matrix, I think. I think it needs to get more attention. It also addresses some of the equity issues, and we have a white paper that San Diego 350 has prepared that we can share with you. And we would like to get an opportunity to talk more about it to this community at some point.
Thank you, Sanjeev. And we're also available to come present if there's any groups that we can present this implementation playbook to, and so that we can get feedback. So please let us know.
Right. My point was that I think it's somehow something that is missing in the playbook or missing in the matrix, and I would like to provide more information so that that can be captured accurately. The potential can be captured accurately. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. We're running a little bit late, so I know that there's Karina. Just a sec, Karina. I'll just try to cover some of the points. We also send a list of case studies that the EPIC team has gathered, and they're asking feedback on these case studies and input on the other studies that you may have heard of. This document is available for review on the Transportation Working Group site on the Engage platform. Karina, if you can just wait for a minute, I'll ask if Scott can come back on the audio and describe what it is that we sent out for your feedback.
Yeah, thanks so much, Murtaza. So one of the things that we're proposing to do in the playbook is, in addition to these lists of potential actions that people can take, is to highlight some projects or studies or actual implementation processes that have taken place or have been done. And again, these will be at the scales that Murtaza talked about at the beginning, at the organizational level, at the community level, and then regionally. And so we, in the materials for this meeting, provided some draft list of a few for each of those scales. Murtaza, do you want me to run through them or just talk generally about the whole thing? You want me to run through real quick?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, and we recognize that there are lots more examples out there. That's in part why we're asking this group for additional thoughts. But at the organizational level, we have the Cajon Valley School District Vehicle to Grid pilot project. I think people may have heard about that in the news recently. Also, the Amazon delivery van electrification process. San Diego is one of the cities where this is being rolled out. And then we highlighted UCSD, could be anybody really, but the remote work policy around telecommuting, alternative work schedules, and work flexibility. At the community level, we have the Escondido Creek Trail project, which was really a trail connectivity issue and bike path project. On one of the transportation calls, the idea of this green Reiteros program came up, where there's an ride sharing program in this case, it's in the Central Valley, and it provides it to farm workers and families. But that's an interesting concept. City of Encinitas has an EV charging ordinance that requires most new buildings, new commercial buildings, I believe, to have EV charging stations. It's both residential and commercial, excuse me. At the regional level, you may be familiar with the Accelerate to Zero Emissions Collaborative, which is seeking to accelerate the amount of electric vehicles we have in the region and other zero emission vehicles. And that is a project led by SANDAG and San Diego Gas and Electric, County of San Diego, the San Diego Air Pollution Control District, and the City of San Diego. And there's a broad stakeholder group on that. But it's a good example of this kind of regional collaboration that we've been talking about on this call. The MAC has a electric vehicle access program, which is a financing program and a kind of a support program to help people living in communities of concern to get electric vehicles. And then we also included the Blue Line trolley extension just as a way of showing how those kind of big capital projects can increase connectivity to really important community centers, in this case, the border all the way up to the UCSD community and UTC. So anyway, these are some examples of the kinds of case studies we'd like to include, and would love to get specific suggestions on other ones that may highlight other aspects that we've talked about today, other than electrification or the kind of the things that we've talked about. There could be, any number of examples. We probably couldn't include all of them, but really looking for your suggestions on other ideas. So thank you, Murtaza.
Thank you, Scott, for compiling this list. We're working, as you can see, on a pretty accelerated schedule on all 5 tracks. So appreciate all your input and the suggestions that you are providing us. And for many of you that are participating, a lot of the public agencies, that it's a long list. So I'll skip that. I'll just go to Karina. Karina is also a council member from Vista. Go ahead, council member.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm here in my capacity as transportation policy advocate for Climate Action Campaign, but I am a council member in the city of Vista. And, one of the things that I have been bringing to people's attention is, if we want to get to a place of being able to have microtransit, especially when we're looking at neighborhood electric vehicles or low speed vehicles, we have to have mapped out where the roads are that are 35 miles per hour or less, and how we can connect different resources within different communities in a way where microtransit can actually reach them. one of the things that I experience a lot is, having to go from, and actually Sean Ellis spoke about this, having to go from Vista to downtown takes such a long time. So the more that we're able to build out our capacity for our buses, so that means ensuring that we have enough bus operators to increase frequency. That is going to help connect us to some of the rail that we have. The coaster, the frequency has been increased, however, it's still not enough. So we definitely have to be able to increase frequencies on the Sprinter, on the coaster, be able to have seamless transitions. I think transit centers need to be places where people feel safe, they feel comfortable, there's shade, there's an easy place to access water. Wayfinding needs to be part of our design, because it could be very difficult to figure out even which platform you're supposed to be on. And then, at the end of the day, if we're not going to get bus rapid transit until, around 2050, then with a time scale like that, we really need to start planning for more rail. That has to be something that we do as a region. And I know it's expensive, I know it takes time, but in order to be able to connect our communities better, we need to be able to do that. And when it comes to our rural communities, there's a lot of folks that are aging in place, and they want to be in a rural environment. So we want to be able to connect them to services as well. So again, microtransit, building out our bus system, making sure we have enough operators, and really focusing on increasing our rail is going to be critical for us to not only reduce VMT and GHG in the future, but to create a seamless connectivity between different communities, because that's the real way that people live. They go from one community to another. But anyways, I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. You had the last word. We apologize for running out of time and starting late. I'm truly sorry for those that could not listen to us in Spanish, but we will try to address that issue going forward. And I want to make sure that all of you know that the regional convenings in January are very important for us and for the process. We would really appreciate if you can attend and get the word out in your community, as we are finalizing these events in each of the supervisorial districts. With that, I'll turn it over to Yasamin to give us an overview of what the next steps are.
All right, everybody. So here's our timeline again through spring of next year. This is to ensure robust engagement, outreach, and that all voices are brought along through the design of the implementation actions. The yellow highlight shows where we are now, which is a special topic working groups to help draft the implementation playbook. And we intend to have a draft of the playbook for public review in December. And as Mortaza was talking about, in January, we will have regional convenings in partnership with community-based organizations to receive public input on our proposed actions. There will be 5 regional convenings, 1 in each supervisorial district, and will include all cities, the unincorporated county, and tribes. So please be sure to join us for these regional convenings. A notice will be sent out as soon as we have finalized the dates. And finally, we intend to seek board adoption of the integrated framework in spring of 2023 and receive direction on regional actions. This concludes our second and final workshop in the Transportation Working Group. Our next working group is on building decarbonization on Tuesday, November 1st. And so if you are interested in attending, please make sure you are registered. And as always, the county appreciates your time and input, and we will see you again soon. So have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.